Herbert von Karajan seemed to come from another world. Karajan above the clouds, a playboy and a genius. Distant, urbane, a perfectionist. That was how the public perceived him. One of the best-dressed men in the world, he became a cornerstone of international high society. But the Karajan myth was only one side of the man. In private, he was quite the opposite of his public image.
He had a very human side, but one didn't notice it because he was so concerned with externals.
Karajan's inner and outer lives never seemed to meet.
Quindi aveva due personalità.
He had two personalities, the great musician and the human being beneath.
E quella di una persona umana.
Two lives in one person. That is the riddle of Herbert von Karajan. Who he really was something he knew less about than anyone else. Anif, near Salzburg, July the 17th, 1989. Herbert von Karajan has been dead for 36 hours. His widow has wasted no time in getting the funeral organized. Karajan is buried secretly at night, with less than 10 people present. Only candles illuminate the ghostly scenario. It is all over in half an hour. All the mourners are shocked by this bizarre ending.
Sono stato scioccato.
I was shattered.
Scioccato. Per me,
he was still warm when they laid him to rest.
The most important musician of the 20th century was buried in a tracksuit.
Mi disse Francesco, quando io morirò.
He said to me, Francesco, when I die, dress me in this tracksuit. It makes me feel a freer man. When he died, I put it on him. Not everyone approved, but I said, that was what the maestro wanted.
E disse, queste erano le volontà del maestro.
The image of the inaccessible genius was also the product of a consistent marketing strategy. Stylized concert recordings promoted the myth of the artist in a trance.
I don't believe Karajan promoted this myth, though he was certainly somewhat vain. But it didn't disturb him. After all, it was good for business.
Right from the beginning, Karajan came across as arrogant. Some thought he was trying to cover up his insecurity. Through her mother, the singer Christa Ludwig had been familiar with Karajan since her earliest days.
He was a shy man, and shy people sometimes do behave in an exaggerated way. That was why he had very little contact with people.
He cut himself off entirely. At school, he hardly spoke a word to the rest of us, particularly at the beginning. He certainly considered himself somehow better than anyone else. There is no doubt in my mind about that.
Living in rented accommodation in Vienna, he was still far away from great success, but he was already practicing the poses.
Da hat nach einer Schallplatte mit seiner Partitur davor dirigiert.
He would play a recording and conduct from the score, just as if he was standing in front of an orchestra. And when it was over, I said, "Herbert, I'm amazed how much you can already do." To which he replied, "Yes, and I'm going to become a famous conductor as well."
Karajan began to enjoy playing the genius. The role became second nature to him. The double life was to become permanent. Christmas at the Karajans. The great conductor is the inconspicuous figure in the background playing Christmas carols.
He was only arrogant to the media. In private, he was a different person, quite different.
The family was very important to Karajan. He had a very deep and close relationship with Eliette, his third wife.
I would call it the great fulfillment of all that an older man in love could wish for.
It was a picture book marriage. The world star and the blonde Dior mannequin, a couple that made ideal front-page material for the international magazines. Eliette giving the butler Francesco instructions for dinner. She played the role of the beautiful wife to the full and with complete devotion.
He set great store by female beauty. I often told him it was unfair. If a woman was not attractive, whether she was an artist or not, then she was uninteresting to him. He was a great aesthete and very responsive to good looks.
Aber für weibliche Schönheit war so sehr, sehr empfänglich.
Karajan had a much more relaxed approach to dinner parties than his wife did. He would sling a pullover casually over his shoulder while she wore the finest evening dresses. Karajan had also far less interest in glittering parties and the social whirl.
Sie war eine junge Frau, sie möchte ihr Leben genießen und ich meine
She was a young woman and wanted to enjoy life. Perhaps she thought that with such a famous husband, her life would be a bed of roses. But there was another side to the coin. He was a very hard worker.
From the outside, the marriage looked very glamorous, but internally it was strictly organized.
Jeder für sich.
Ultimately, they both lived for themselves, and when they had time to spare, they spent it together. Every day was organized precisely as he wanted it.
Es ist von ihm eigentlich eingeteilt worden, wie der Tag zu laufen hat.
When he had a concert, he didn't wait to see whether she was ready. I drove off with him, and Francesco brought her later in the interval. He wouldn't wait 5 minutes for her.
It can't have been a simple marriage. But you mustn't forget that he had had 2 wives before me, so he was thoroughly trained. And at 50 years of age, he certainly knew what he was letting himself in for.
And yet, Karajan clearly had a strong need for a harmonious life.
He was always the one who retired first. When he left his dinner on the table and went up to his room, we knew that the evening was over.
Karajan tried to spend all his free time with his family. He loved being with them in the garden or on the beach with the children.
I have a great deal of time for my family. In fact, the time left over once my work is done belongs to my wife and my 2 children. Isabel, does your father play with you much?
Yes, when he's here.
What games do you play together? What do you play with him?
We don't play games so much, more sport.
What sports? Swimming?
Yes, in summer.
Karajan's two daughters, Isabel and Arabelle, meant everything to him. But in his family life, one wish remained unfulfilled.
Mi confidò che sentiva di avere un maschio.
He once told me that he would have liked to have had a son. He said, "Francesco, we can't have everything in life." He didn't tell me why, he just said, "You can't have everything in life." His greatest wish was to have a son, to whom he could pass on all the good things that life had brought him.
Tutto ciò che nella vita lui ha fatto e di trasmetterlo a suo figlio.
Francesco the butler saw himself as a kind of ersatz son.
Lo sentivo come un padre.
I felt that he was like a father to me, and he gave me the feeling that he saw me as a son, if I am not mistaken. But I felt that he treated me like a son.
Sentivo questa impressione che lui mi vedeva come un suo figlio, mi vedeva. E voleva che mi fece prendere il brevetto di pilota.
He wanted me to get a pilot's license in Salzburg, and he wanted me to drive his big cars. He wanted to give me all the pleasures that he would have wanted his son to enjoy.
Come se lui avesse voluto fare su suo figlio.
But Karajan had a much more distant relationship with his brother Wolfgang, who was an organist.
I always had the feeling of being the child that was left behind. This was the result of many factors. One was that as the second born, I was always compared with my elder brother. He is big and strong, and you are small and weak. And of course, I found that maddening.
Und später haben sie dann.
Even later, they never really made up their differences. Each one had his own world, and neither wanted to disturb the other.
In seiner Welt, glaube ich, stören und so. Und bis dann die beiden Mädchen, Isabel und Arabelle.
Until the two girls, Isabel and Arabelle, said, "We've got an uncle that we don't know at all."
Den kennen wir gar nicht.
But although this led to a warm-hearted reunion, Karajan hardly had any more contact with Wolfgang and his wife.
Wir waren auf einer Konzertreise durch Deutschland und
We were on a concert tour in Germany, and his brother died in Salzburg. I thought he would interrupt the tour to attend the funeral, but no.
Ultimately, there wasn't a close relationship between Herbert and Wolfgang. Karajan also had very little interest in fine cuisine. At mealtimes, as in all fields of everyday life, he liked things to be kept simple.
Spaghetti in bianco, olio
A dish of
d'oliva,
spaghetti.
basilico e parmigiano. Quello era il suo
That was
piatto
his favorite
preferito.
dish.
ganz einfache Weine getrunken.
He also had a simple taste in wine. It was a mystery to him how people could talk about wines for hours on end. To him, that was a waste of time. He had very simple tastes.
Karajan loved the food he had eaten as a child, which was basically simple country food. He smoked one cigarette a day at the most, one of his very few indulgences. In the evenings, Karajan would gather his concentration for his work. For a certain time before and after a performance, he was lost to the world.
When the concert was over, I would already be in the car, which I had warmed up to at least 28 degrees, as he would be wet with sweat. We never exchanged a word. It was impossible to talk to him. He was still in a world of his own.
In the evenings, he liked to watch television in his hotel with the manager of his film firm and his wife. Columbo and John Wayne were his heroes. He loved westerns more than anything else.
Spielen wir das Lied vom Tod, habe ich bestimmt 15 Mal oder
I must have seen Once Upon a Time in the West 15 times or more. I remember we watched it once in Berlin. We sat on the floor and he had a whiskey glass in one hand and a Marlboro cigarette in the other. And Karajan always said, "When I'm holding a whiskey glass and a cigarette, then I feel like John Wayne."
Whiskyglas in der Hand habe und die Marlboro, fühle ich mich wie John Wayne.
Karajan's houses all gave the impression of being very grand. At first, he only rented the house by the beach at Saint-Tropez, and then he bought it. But he was not so interested in the chic Saint-Tropez jet set as in being close to the Mediterranean sea and coast. The houses in Anif near Salzburg and Mauerbach outside Vienna also looked grander than they actually were. For Karajan, getting away from the city was the most important thing.
I'm not a town person. I was born in the country, and that's where I want to live.
Karajan's main home was in St. Moritz in the Swiss Alps, where he spent as much time as possible in the open air. Although it was the noblest of his houses, nevertheless, there was nothing showy about it.
Sehr bequem alles, groß natürlich.
Everything was very comfortable, very spacious, with wonderful gardens, but very simply furnished. He had no feeling for living with art. He could never understand how people could get so enthusiastic about precious antiques. In France, he was once presented with a particularly valuable vase. Afterwards, he said to me, "What shall I do with it? Do you want it? If you don't, then let's throw it off the Eiffel Tower."
Karajan could only stand porcelain on a much smaller scale. When he was all on his own, he would play with his porcelain zoo, little animals that he would arrange in groups.
Like a child, woe betide anyone who touched them. The cleaning lady wanted to dust them once, and he forbade her to touch them.
Here, the great conductor was doing small-scale directing. And yet, Karajan never wanted anyone to know that his private life was so simple. On the contrary, he liked to promote the jet-setter image. He had himself filmed as a pilot with the world at his feet.
He had already drawn up the flight plan on his bed at home. He knew all about the weather conditions. He had studied them. And when the airplane arrived in Salzburg or in St. Moritz, he was the happiest man on earth. Since that day, I can understand card players who see themselves in their cards. It's only when you are so far gone that you see yourself in the flying instruments that you can really do it well.
Karajan venerated technology and all its masters.
When we came into the office, there were two pilots sitting there who had flown with him in his jet. And because they were capable of handling a machine that fascinated him, his own airplane, I had the feeling that he looked up to them as if they were two great men, and they were normal pilots. Maybe he was a little awestruck? Yes, I guess that was it. Awestruck just about sums it up.
When Concorde made a one-off stop at Salzburg, Karajan was determined to join the select few taken on a short flight. He sat behind the pilots and looked on like a child.
What impressed you especially? The maneuverability, like a fighter plane. With that weight, it handles like a light aircraft. Fabulous.
Karajan's Saint-Tropez racing yacht was also seen as a high-life toy. It is one of the fastest yachts of his day and had an 18-man professional crew. What Karajan most liked was setting the sails when a storm was brewing. His greatest pleasure was getting the very best out of his boat.
Sailing in a storm was like an orgasm. In weather like that, Karajan's boat was the only one in the Gulf of Saint-Tropez.
Karajan also followed high society in the winter months, leaving his tracks in the snow at St. Moritz, the El Dorado of alpine sports. Whoever saw him there must have thought him a seasoned playboy. Karajan was also just as notorious for his love of fast cars. He always bought the newest and fastest models, often prototypes. In Salzburg, he knew familiar roads where he could step on the gas. Karajan would sometimes pay for time on private racing tracks.
I went to pick him up with a Peugeot 205 Rally, and we went together to a private circuit in Mortefontaine, close to Paris, and he asked me to drive. And I must have been co-driver for 15 years, but I've never been as scared as for those few laps we did together with him.
Mein Mann musste einmal mit ihm mitfahren.
Once my husband was in the passenger seat. Suddenly, on a very remote road, the steering wheel came loose in Karajan's hands. Some screws had come undone. Somehow, they found their way to a car mechanic's.
I was often with him in the car and couldn't help lifting my right foot at every tree we passed. It was sometimes very close.
Newspaper reports that Karajan had written off his Porsche turned out to be a false alarm. But Karajan, the racing driver, didn't live an entirely accident-free life.
We
had a rehearsal and he arrived late. He had come off the road somewhere and his car had ended up in a field. I don't know about the car, but he wasn't hurt. He just turned up late at the rehearsal, which he then conducted in a masterly fashion as if nothing had happened. In the last 2 years, he had certainly lost a sense of how far he could go. Sometimes between 150 and 200 kilometers per hour, you could see it was really an effort for him.
It seemed as though Karajan had reinvented the whole business of looking casual. The fashion world voted him Best Dressed Man of the Year. The curl on his forehead with its sapphire shimmer was a legend.
After I had tidied up his hair, his secretary, Herr von Mattoni, would set his curl with a swift stroke of the brush.
Die hat da immer so mit Schwung reingezogen, hat eben sich noch einmal hergerichtet.
It was very rare that Karajan appeared in public wearing glasses. He did all he could to hide the signs of age.
Als ich ihm wieder Haare schnitt, sagte Herr Willi, lassen Sie mir das da hinten.
Once when I was cutting his hair, he said, Herr Willi, leave my hair a little longer on the back of the neck, would you? Especially just at the sides. Actually, he didn't have very much hair there at all.
Und wollte mich damals ein bisschen überlisten, denn
in fact, he was trying to pull the wool over my eyes because I immediately saw that just there he had tiny scars left and right. I still believed that these had been caused by a facelift, and he wanted to cover them up so they wouldn't be seen.
And yet Karajan noticed that he couldn't keep pace with his own myth forever. The curse of his double life finally caught up with him. Karajan could only be at ease with himself when he was on his own.
Hat 90% mit sich selbst ausgemacht, ganz sicher. Hat sich auch
For 90% of his life, he lived simply for himself. He spent a great deal of time on his own. There were certain times of day when nobody was allowed to see him and no telephone calls were put through. But that was his work, which really was the most important thing in his life.
Karajan's study scores were entirely free of personal annotations. He did most of his work in bed, memorizing the scores and the music and listening to recordings with headphones. He used meditation techniques in order to be able to maintain high levels of concentration for hours on end. For instance, he would immerse himself in the idea of using mental powers to lift a ring from the bed of a pond.
That way we gain access to another world of experience. We reach a place where the mind becomes more highly attuned.
He
concentrated so intensely. He once asked me to call him to dinner at 9:30. I went into his room where he was seated, studying a score. He looked at me. Maestro, 9:30, I said. He didn't see me. Maestro, I said.
Maestro.
Maestro.
Signor maestro.
Francesco, he said, you gave me such a fright. Why didn't you say that you were there? But I've been standing here for a quarter of an hour, I said. He was concentrating so intensely. He was in a trance. The music stopped him from seeing anyone.
Con la musica lui non vedeva più persone.
Concentration. Yes, concentration, of course. Because I believe that inner concentration has become much more important. The feeling that one is more involved in a thing than one was before.
Karajan was given his first lessons in concentration by his father, who was a Salzburg surgeon. Before every operation, he went for a 20-minute walk to the hospital, as he explained to his son Herbert.
It is when I'm out walking that I can best concentrate on what is coming. I think of the operations that I've done, how they went, what were the dangerous moments. And I let everything go through my mind so that I am fully prepared when I arrive.
Karajan was just as concentrated when conducting as he was when studying scores. He called it
a rendering of something that is perfect within oneself.
Closing his eyes helped him to recall the music from his memory.
I don't have as good a memory as De Sabata or Metropolis, for instance. They had real photographic memories. Once they'd seen something, they could keep it in their minds. You know the Vienna Philharmonic joke about Metropolis? At a certain point, they would say, now he's turning the page. I have a different kind of memory, an intuitive memory. I must hear it in my mind.
He couldn't understand how his colleagues could accompany singers and keep an eye on the orchestra at the same time as looking into the score. Mentioning no names, it was a mystery to him how some of his most famous colleagues could conduct a Brahms symphony from the score.
Karajan conducted experiments on himself in order to investigate the effect that music had upon him.
At one Siegfried rehearsal with orchestra, I was wired up to the kind of machine that is used to monitor the condition of cosmonauts on a flight to the moon. It measures movements in the brain, the heartbeat, the pulse, blood pressure, and principally the galvanic skin reflex, which is in fact the best indicator for emotional involvement when performing or listening to music.
Für die emotionelle Anteil beim Musikerleben übernimmt.
The experiment showed that while the work of the conductor was not dangerous for a healthy heart, it was just as exhausting as high-level sport. The more Karajan became immersed in his work, the less interest he had in the high life. He preferred quiet conversations with a few friends on topics of common interest.
He always sent me to the big social events.
Hat nie irgendwie ein social life Leben geführt. Nie.
He was never a socialite. When Eliette went on to the Goldener Hirsch, she went alone. I can never remember him going with her. He always had rehearsals the next day, so he never could. He was a huge worker.
Karajan seemed to be a prisoner in a world of his own. He often talked more to himself than to others. From childhood, he had always had slightly retarded speech.
Auf 1, 2, 3, los, geht zuerst oben der Hänger hinauf und dann ist es abfahren. Wenn Sie merken, dass das...
When you notice that the whole thing is coming down, then pull the flap and fall over with the tower.
Achtung! Achtung, fertig.
It was often extremely difficult to follow what Karajan was saying. He often didn't finish his sentences. He would interrupt the sentences shortly before the end, sure that he had been fully understood, and then he would start with the next sentence. Some of us didn't find it easy to understand him properly. I am a very introverted person. One talent I definitely lack is the one my daughters have, for getting on with people straight away.
The lonely genius. This was another respect in which Karajan was at times one with his image. Opinions differ on how lonely he really felt.
Ich glaube,
I think, or rather I know, that Karajan was certainly a very solitary and lonely man.
Nein, Einsamkeit, das hat man...
Loneliness? No, that was just the way some people interpreted his behaviour. He was not a lonely person. He was always busy with something or other.
Hat immer sich mit irgendwas beschäftigt.
With Karajan, loneliness was relative. With certain friends, such as the Archbishop of Vienna, Franz Koenig, he would talk for hours. Dr. Johannes Huber, then the Cardinal's secretary, now a celebrated doctor, remembers this well.
The main thing was that they talked for so long. Although Cardinal Koenig preferred not to eat in the evenings at all, with Karajan the minutes became hours and the dinner went on and on. But that was the only thing that one might call stressful. The conversation was always very interesting and interactive. Eliette took part, asking many lively questions. Sometimes the girls came too. And the maestro was also capable of listening and learning from the cardinal. It was by no means a monologue, and Karajan certainly did not conduct the conversation.
Nevertheless, spending time alone was an integral part of Karajan's philosophy. He couldn't really trust people because so many wanted to curry favor with him.
I have a small circle of friends who never flatter me. They are all capable of telling me the truth.
He was a miserable judge of human character. When he had to choose a new member of staff from 10 applicants, he would always choose the one who had just come out of prison.
I think that my wife is a much better judge of character than I am. There is always a danger of me getting too enthusiastic and making a mistake that I will regret later.
The Karajan's house was always full of guests, invited and uninvited.
He always had a train of 20 or so people in his wake. If they were just there for the food and drink, then he didn't care. But some wanted more, and then he changed his tune. Then he would say, "Josef, just see that these people clear off."
Distancing himself from his environment was part of Karajan's survival instinct. The public always expected Karajan to behave like a man of the world, but sometimes his deeply rooted shyness got the upper hand. When he conducted Mozart's coronation mass in Rome and had an audience with the Pope, he hardly managed to speak a word. John Paul II conducted the conversation almost entirely on his own. Karajan had no time for dissimulation. Once he got into difficulties over a meeting that had been planned with Steven Spielberg.
Karajan wanted to meet him the very next week in Los Angeles, and we made the mistake of taking him to the film E.T. in New York, which he didn't like at all. He said it was a film for children and not even funny. He didn't like the sad figure of E.T. at all, but the contact with Spielberg had been established, and Herr von Karajan said, "I can't lie and I don't want to meet him anymore." We had to use all our diplomatic skills to cancel the meeting with a white lie about the maestro not having enough time.
Karajan was secretive about many things that were important to him. He was terrified of being taken hostage by the Baader-Meinhof group and took safety precautions.
We always took this revolver with us. Herr von Karajan and I were the only ones who knew. He had a revolver of his own as well, and when the kidnappings began, we always had this one in the car. The boss had his own at home, which he kept in his bedside table.
In Saint-Tropez, Karajan once even had to use his revolver to frighten away burglars. For fear of the terrorists, Karajan instructed his driver to change his route regularly, and from that point on, drove less showy cars. Karajan was good friends with Alfred Herrhausen, the head of the Deutsche Bank, who was later one of the Baader-Meinhof Group's victims. Karajan had him invest part of his assets. He was also supposed to have played an important part in taking care of Karajan's estate, but shortly after the conductor died, he lost his life in a bomb attack. Herrhausen had been one of the few people who had even a rough idea of how rich Karajan actually was. The extent of the Karajan fortune was for a long time one of the most eagerly sought-after secrets in popular journalism. Outside the family, the only person who could have told the truth was the man who was to be Karajan's executor, Werner Cooper, but he kept a low profile.
With a mixture of delight, astonishment, and annoyance, I once read that Karajan had left his widow between 200 and 300 billion Swiss francs. Anyone knows that can't have been true because it would have been more than the wealth of the 5 richest people in the world put together, including Bill Gates and the Sultan of Brunei.
Inklusive Bill Gates und der Sultan von Brunei, und dann wären wir immer noch nicht auf 200 Milliarden.
The extent of Karajan's fortune can be deduced approximately from data related to his recordings, which were by far his biggest source of income. It is estimated that sales of LPs and CDs earned him a total of around $250 million. It was particularly with the arrival of the CD that Karajan's recording sales boomed, with many of his old recordings being reissued in the new medium. The Karajan CD boom was to remain undiminished for a good 10 years after his death. Karajan's performing fees, on the other hand, were never excessive.
He got so little in Berlin, a quarter of what guest conductors were paid, and he traveled in his own airplane and paid his own hotel and telephone bills. I remember that when Bernstein conducted Mahler's Ninth in Berlin, his fee was between 5 and 6 times as much as Karajan's. Many conductors wouldn't accept Karajan's fee these days.
Only relatively late in his career did he start to get rich. At the beginning, he often lived very much from one month to the next.
I began with 80 marks a month and was earning 120 marks a month when I left 7 years later. Back then, pay increases were not what they are now.
Karajan reached the first high point in his career during the Third Reich. The Nazis considered that their star conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler was getting too independent. The propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels wanted to set Karajan up as a counterbalance who he could control. Karajan and Goebbels met personally.
He told me he had to remember not to look at Goebbels' club foot, because he had heard that if you did that, then you would be out of favour, and that would have been the end of his career.
But Goebbels' plans with Karajan never came to fruition. Hitler could not warm to the rising star and held him to blame when Hans Sachs made a mistake in a performance of Die Meistersinger.
There was a moment when things went slightly wrong. Anyone who knew the piece well would have noticed, but a few moments later everything was back on track. Someone whispered to Hitler that it happened because I was conducting from memory. I think Goebbels then said, I should be told to conduct from the score. The next time I got up on the podium, there was a score there, so I promptly turned it over and upside down and conducted from memory. That didn't make me very popular, but when it comes to conducting, nobody tells me how to do it.
Shortly before the end of the war, Karajan and his second wife fled penniless over the Alps to Italy to avoid being recruited for the Wehrmacht.
Sie waren ja ziemlich arm.
They were quite poor after the war. I know that Karajan's second wife went over the mountains with him. He had no job and she gave English lessons.
Und hatte keine Stellung.
When he returned to Austria, the Allies initially prohibited him from practicing his profession. Karajan had twice joined the Nazi Party in order to be eligible for a principal conductor post, but he was very composed when he was questioned by the US Army.
Zunächst mal war ganz anders als fast alle anderen.
Firstly, he behaved in quite a different way from almost anyone we had dealings with. He was completely calm. He was even a little disdainful, but not arrogant. He began by calmly admitting that he had been a party member and distanced himself from the alibis that had been offered up on his behalf.
Alibis, die für ihn geltend gemacht werden, gar nicht hören wollte. Zum Beispiel, welche Alibis? Also zum Beispiel, hat gesagt, es ist ja bekannt.
The fact that his wife was partly Jewish, for instance, he said this shouldn't be regarded as a point in his favor. It was a private matter and had nothing to do with anyone else.
Although Karajan was allowed to perform again from 1947 onwards, his income was initially very meager.
Wie er das erste Mal in Genf war, nicht?
When he was in Geneva the first time, he went from one watch shop to another and looked in the windows. He once told me that he stood there thinking, will I ever be able to buy a watch like that? Touching, really, don't you think?
Also, ist schon rührend, nicht?
At the height of his financial success, however, Karajan did sometimes lose touch with the smaller things.
Hat einmal gesagt,
once he asked me, do you happen to know what a cinema ticket costs? Yes, I said, I do.
But Karajan was always in the picture as far as bigger things were concerned. He invested his assets carefully and always studied the bank's quarterly reports.
He didn't want to have his money handled in the same way that I would handle money for widows and orphans. He said I could occasionally do something more interesting, but nothing speculative.
But Karajan was less and less able to enjoy the fruits of his wealth. Finally, the man who had been the epitome of the sporting look, of elegance and of superiority, was hardly able to walk. Illness forced him to say farewell to his fashionable hobbies.
Ich habe alles aufgegeben, was mir früher Freude gemacht hat.
I have had to give up everything that used to give me pleasure. I just can't do these things anymore. I can't sail, I can't climb, I can't ski. All that is over.
Seriöserweise dirigiere, bin ich laut ärztlichem.
My medical record tells me that since I started conducting, I have had 44 major problems, really serious things, not just coughs and colds. 12 operations. That's enough to drive a man crazy, but it doesn't affect me. You have a lot taken away from you, and you get as much and more back in return.
Aber es wird ihnen manches genommen, sie kriegen viel mehr dazu.
Karajan on the way to a concert in Paris, besieged by journalists. They had not yet understood that this was now a different Karajan, one that had thrown his public ego overboard. His illness was to help him to escape from his role as demigod of the musical world. His earlier vanity was now a thing of the past.
I remember something had been recorded and then there was an interruption because the orchestra had a break. I saw that one of his buttons had come undone and sent an assistant to do it up. Then he said, "What am I now, a conductor or a model?" By then, these things didn't matter to him. Very different from how it had been before.
Also zu dem damaligen Zeitpunkt war ihm das eigentlich schon ziemlich egal. Früher war das nicht so.
Karajan's decades of suffering had in fact begun with one unfortunate moment in the pool at St. Moritz.
First it was slipped discs, then he had problems with his bones. Obviously he had developed osteoporosis.
In spite of all the risks, Karajan decided to have an operation on his spine. It is possible that the operation only made things worse.
It might have been so. I can't prove it, but there is a certain probability, even a high probability, that that was the case. He put it as follows to me. If a horse is yoked to a wagon and pulls it up a mountain until the horse is completely exhausted, and then the carter whips the horse, after a while the horse won't feel the lashes and will just push it on as best it can. That's exactly how it is with me.
In medical matters, he trusted his private doctor, Professor Simon. Not all Karajan's family and friends approved of Simon. Some felt he was too much like a guru.
Only the diastole can be shortened. Even when the heartbeat is very high, the systole cannot be shortened. If the heartbeat gets faster, then it is the diastole that is cut.
Karajan's illness robbed him of many things he loved. He invested his freed-up energies into his own film company. Télé Mondiale was intended to put his artistic legacy on the market for posterity. Télé Mondiale was based in Monaco and managed by Uli Merkel, who was under oath to Karajan.
Versprechen Sie mir, dass Sie dafür sorgen, dass diese
Give me your solemn promise that you will ensure that these films are finished and shown to the public.
Und überlegen Sie sich auch, was wir auch besprochen hatten, was kann man alles
And think about what can be done to ensure that my memory is preserved as the man who did this and did that.
als der Mann, der das und das gemacht hat.
Karajan hat immer schon
Karajan had always worked for eternity and had his mind on eternity, on a limited eternity at least. It must have been clear to him that he wanted to achieve what Toscanini and Furtwängler had ensured in their day, that people would always want their recordings.
Ein Toscanini, ein Furtwängler erreicht hatte, dass man deren Aufnahmen eigentlich weiterhin haben wollte.
At great financial and technical cost, Karajan made additional recordings of 45 operas so that they could one day be brought out as optical video discs.
These recordings cost him an enormous amount. He once confided in me, "You know, it is crazy how much I'm spending, but I have enough in reserve."
Karajan paid all Télé Mondiale's expenses from his private assets.
The firm did not earn a single penny. There were just expenses aimed at paving the way for Télé Mondiale to become a business one day.
For Télé Mondiale, Karajan gave free rein to his perfectionism as a conductor and as a stage director. He had the greatest hopes in what these recordings could do. For years of his life, he hardly thought of anything but these concert recordings. But Karajan's concert films have not sold as well as expected. Nowadays, his sterile aesthetic is considered out of date.
Sie dürfen nicht mich fragen.
Don't ask me if it was an error of judgment or who was at fault. It is a little bit like fashion. At that time, everyone was convinced it had to be that way.
War jeder überzeugt, so muss es sein.
Würden Sie sagen, dass Herbert von
Would Karajan have been happy with the attention given to his legacy by the world today? No, I don't think he would. He was certainly hoping for more.
Sicher mehr erhofft.
Karajan often said,
Sometimes, to be honest, I wish I had been born 10 years later.
but the visionary's attempt to market his legacy on video disc was a failure. In his will, he put part of the family's inheritance into an endowment limited to a certain period. Uli Merkel was to use the money to put the artistic legacy into shape and to market it.
Wem das nicht passt,
Even if people don't like it, there is nothing I can do. That was his will, and my job is to fulfill it. And if anyone gets in my way, I can guarantee they will come out worse.
The Karajan Center on the Ring in Vienna was also part of the overall strategy designed to preserve Karajan's name for perpetuity.
I have long wished to make one certain place a focused centre for my husband's work. Now I hope this wish has been fulfilled.
Heute ist dieser Wunsch hoffentlich erfüllt.
However, as soon as the Telemondial Foundation's time limit expired, Eliette closed down the Karajan Centre and moved it to smaller premises in Salzburg. Back to 1989. On July the 16th, Karajan rang his secretary unusually early.
The thing that was like a stab in the heart was that he made a special point of thanking me for everything I had done for him. Then I knew it would be a terrible day.
Physical weakness forced Karajan to interrupt a discussion with Sony manager Norio Oga. A doctor was flown in by helicopter.
I said, the maestro is still living, still breathing. The doctor said, no, the maestro has left us. I opened up the respiratory passages and tried to resuscitate him. But there was nothing to be done. It was certainly a heart attack. He died happy.
Se n'è andato, non so, felice.
Karajan had left the glamour of the world behind him. His end could have not been simpler. But the pomp that Karajan believed he had escaped caught up with him after his death. A few days after his burial, he was honoured with a memorial service in Salzburg Cathedral. The public could not accept the glamorous star coming to such a simple end. It had always been his fate to lead a double life.
As a wanderer between two worlds, on his path from a changing world to an unchanging one.
Unvergängliche Welt.
You know the Berlin Philharmonic joke? A couple are sitting in a concert, and when it begins, the husband leans over to his wife and whispers, "Tell me when he begins to be fascinating."